Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Monder. I'm a program manager with the Ohio Children's Trust Fund, and we're pleased to be partnering with redtreehouse.org as well as the Franklin County Family and Children First Council on today's webinar. I'm going to be handling the technical end of the webinar, and I just wanted to very briefly go through a couple of housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and in the coming days we will be having this webinar posted on Red Treehouse's website, which is redtreehouse.org. And for those of you who aren't aware, Red Treehouse is Ohio's online resource that connects families and professionals to resources, organizations, and events for learning, help, and support, and strongly encourage everyone to visit redtreehouse.org and utilize the resources that are available on that website. Everyone's line right now is currently muted. Again, given that we have or plan on having well over 200 individuals on this webinar, we don't want to be picking up any background noise or music or anything of that nature. So we've gone ahead and muted everyone's lines. Our presenter today, Carol Taylor from Franklin County Family and Children First Council, will be periodically throughout her presentation stopping to answer any questions that you may have. You can ask questions one of two ways. You'll see an attendee box, which you should be able to then click on. Looks like a little hand that's sort of giving a high five. You click on that, and it'll really, in effect, show that you've got your hand raised and you want to ask a question, and I can then unmute your line and you can ask your question. Sometimes we have limited success with this route. The more reliable a route for asking questions, if you'll see it on your control panel for the webinar, you'll see a question bar, and if you click on the little plus sign on that questions bar, you should open up an area where you can type any questions you may have, and send those, and they'll come directly to me. And when Carol pauses for some question answers, I will relay those questions to her. Obviously, we want to be respectful of everyone's time. Everyone's got a busy schedule, and we try to avoid going over on our allotted time. So if we are unable to get to your question, we are archiving those questions, and we will get back to you with a response. And obviously, if during the webinar, if anybody's having any technical difficulties seeing or hearing, please, again, use that question box. Is probably the best way to relay to me that you're having some difficulty, and we can do what we can to try and resolve that. And without further delay, I'd like to introduce Carol Taylor at Franklin County Family and Children First Council, who's going to be our presenter in our webinar today. Carol, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so excited that you're here, and looking forward to sharing the next 53 or so minutes with you. I come to you today from the Franklin County Family and Children First Council, and certainly want to thank the Ohio Children's Trust Fund, I'm sorry, I was reading my screen instead of talking to you, and Red Treehouse certainly for the opportunity. And want to be able to share some information with you today about the brain, its development, and the impact that traumatic stress and trauma can certainly have on brain development, kids' behavior, kids' learning, and families. So I'd like to get started if we can. We have a lot to cover in a pretty short amount of time. As David indicated, I will be willing to take questions throughout the presentation. I will pause periodically to answer those, as well as I will make sure that I leave about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation if anybody wants to chime in at that point. Let me start by saying that all of the information that I will be sharing with you today is not my research, it is not my work. I will be sharing with you the work of Dr. Bruce Perry, and if you're not familiar with Dr. Perry, I certainly encourage you to go out and do a little search in the childtrauma.org website, and you will find many articles and further information of Dr. Perry's work. Here at the Franklin County Family and Children First Council, we've been active with Dr. Perry and his organization for about 4 years, and recently this spring I completed all of the coursework that I needed to be a trainer for the Neurosequential Model in Education for Dr. Perry. So I'll be sharing some of that information with you today. When we think about children and the brain, that's kind of the organ that we're going to be talking about all day today. And I want to recognize, first of all, that the brain is an incredibly complex, magnificent organ that is responsible for much of what happens in our bodies and in our interactions and our feelings with other people. However, if you're going to talk to the general public about the brain, you need to recognize you don't understand a lot about it, and you need to make it a whole lot simpler for people to understand. So what I'm going to do is put up on my screen for you a slide, I hope. Accept. There we go. All right, let's take a look at this slide. What you see before you is Dr. Perry's heuristic of the brain and what he likes to use to explain the brain to people. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this particular slide for a bit here. And I'll make it a little bit bigger for you so that you can see it. And what I'd like to talk about with this particular slide is understanding that the brain develops from the bottom to the top and from the inside out. The brain develops primarily at the brainstem level in utero, and that part of the brain is really responsible for fairly simplistic functions of the brain and mediates things like blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature, those kinds of functions of our body. Very important. It's also a part of the brain that is very responsible for our survival. It's definitely the part of your brain that is reactive, so it's the part of your brain that will keep things, keep you from keeping your hand on something hot, or have you duck if something is coming at your head. So certainly an important part of the brain. However, understanding a little bit about that part of the brain puts kids' behavior in perspective and adults' behavior as well, in that it is not an incredibly smart part of the brain. It's a part of the brain that is solely intended to react to what is in the world. So when information comes into our bodies from the outside world through our senses, or comes into our body internally from things like our body saying, I need more oxygen or I need more glucose, it comes through the brainstem. And the brainstem gets to decide, is this information familiar and is it safe? And if it passes those two tests, it kind of heads on through the rest of the body or through the rest of the brain so that our brain can mediate that information. If that information is found to be unfamiliar or unsafe, the brain will react to it. And so, for example, oftentimes when I'm talking with teachers, I will remind them to think about the amount of times in a day that somebody comes to the door. And somebody walks into the door of a classroom, immediately people turn and look. And for kids, their brainstem at that point is responding to, is this person familiar and are they safe? And so if that person is perceived to be unfamiliar or unsafe, kids can't go back to learning. They're kind of stuck there because they need to be able to calm their brain down enough to say this is okay. So one of the most simplistic things that I ask teachers to do is to greet people when they come through the door so that kids can then understand, yes, this person is at least familiar to my teacher and is safe. And so that's a small tidbit, but to think about how reactive that part of our brain is, even in something as simple as someone coming into the door, can distract. Moving beyond the brainstem, we have the diencephalon. I will only use that word likely once today. That's a big word. I will call it the motor part of the brain. But the motor part of the brain is responsible for things like our appetite, things like our motivation, gets our small and fine motor skills, our large motor skills, helps us walk, run, all those kinds of things. Our limbic system is really our emotional center, our place where we connect to other human beings. And the cortex is the smartest part of our brain. It's the part that is kind of responsible for our ability to problem solve. It mediates our long-term thought, our abstract thinking, helps us make decisions. And so we want people around us, if we are trying to teach or to parent or to guide, mentor, coach, any kinds of those things, if we're a supervisor at work, we want access to people's cortexes. We need to have their smart part of their brain engaged throughout the day. We need them to be willing to take in new information and be able to assimilate that information into what they know so that they can make decisions and interact with the rest of the world. To get from the brainstem where information comes in to the cortex is a really long road. And it is a road filled with thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of neural connections that I really kind of try to think of like a highway system. And if you think about any typical highway system, it's usually a pretty good flowing, easy to use system at about 2 in the morning. Maybe not so much at about 4:30 on a Friday afternoon if you live in a metro area, or during any kind of a big festival, those kinds of things. So when you think about that highway system in the brain, very similar. If we have too much on it, it gets really gummed up, doesn't move efficiently, doesn't move real effectively. Doesn't mean you can't get there, it just means that it will move very slow and very inefficiently. Sometimes on a highway system, if we have a big crash, a big accident happens, traffic can come to a standstill until those people with the helper people with their flashing lights come in and do what they need to do and clean up the mess, and then traffic can begin to flow again. Much similar in the brain. If we've had some sort of a big traumatic event, something big has happened in a moment, there can be kind of some gum up in that part of the brain. We may see people who are having flashbacks and nightmares, maybe being very tearful, having a hard time reacting to the world normally, right immediately following a traumatic event. And so, again, not that we can't get information through, but it's going to be a little inefficient for a while.
Carol, if I can jump in for just a second. We've had a couple people
Sure.
asked if you could, the little box that says slideshow, it's sort of blocking the title. Is there a way to X that and get that?
Slideshow, where are you?
Looks like it's right in the middle, blocking the first couple words of the title of the slide.
Oh, didn't even see that little box. Sure.
And also,
and I can't make it go back to slideshow mode. I can't get it off of this slide. There we go. There we go. Great. How about that? Does that look a little better?
Perfect. And I know a couple folks have communicated that they're picking up some kind of background music, and we are working on that right now.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
I apologize. That's not my phone, so I don't know. Okay. So here we go. So we just got done with a crash. And if we've had a traumatic event, there is a period of time when we do need helper people to come in. We may need some counseling. We may need some OT, PT, some of those kinds of folks to come in and do the cleanup work that they do to help restore some sort of normal flow of information. Then we certainly have times when we consider a highway system that maybe we have a lane that is under construction, or a lane, they're widening a road. And if you've ever been on a highway where they're doing that, you know that can be really, really, really messy and confusing. Very similar in the brain to considering young children. Their brains are still developing. They don't have that strong same information highway in their brains that an adult does. And so it's going to take longer to teach them certain things. You'll have to teach it differently because they don't have that really strong system already in place. So when I think of the neural pathways in the brain that are going to move information, I kind of try to remember it's like a highway system. So if I have a young child, or if I have a young child who's just had a traumatic event, I want you to think about that like a horrific traffic jam in the middle of Chicago, and to try and have some patience with that process, that it's going to take a little bit of time. Let's talk about how those neural connections get formed, because if they're that important to moving information from the brainstem to the cortex, we want to make sure that they get formed, and that they get formed effectively and efficiently. Neural connections are made anytime that two neurons in the brain fire at the same time with enough repetition that they get connected. And so now that all sounds really sciencey and really complicated. However, let me say you have all at some point witnessed this if you've ever been around a young child. So just for the sake of imagination, let's imagine that you have a 10 or 11-month-old child near you, and in front of you and the child walks a four-legged furry object. And somebody around the child, you probably will say, dog. And when you said dog, two things happen. An auditory neuron and a visual neuron in the brain got activated at the exact same time. And any of us who have ever been around children know that you don't just say dog once to a child. You will say that over and over and over again. And every time that you do, that neural connection gets closer and closer and closer until it eventually forms. And at some point in time, that child will then point at that four-legged furry object and say, dog. And you've all witnessed that moment. And when you have, you've seen the result of a neural connection being formed. Now that seems really exciting, except that when I put this in perspective for you, it seems pretty mundane, in that that neural connection process happens 1 trillion times in the womb. So before a baby ever takes its first breath outside of the womb, 1 trillion of those connections have already happened. And they've been established in an environment where the child or the embryo, the infant, was in a complete state of homeostasis. They were in a time where they were not cold, they were not hot, they were not hungry, their every need was met, and they were safe. They also were in an environment for that time in the womb where there was a constant environment of rhythm associated with mom's heart rate. And so while those 1 trillion neural connections were being formed, there was constant rhythm in the background. I share that with you to say, from the moment we take a breath outside of the womb until the moment of death, we will seek rhythm to feel in a state of homeostasis, or a state of what Dr. Perry calls regulated. And so thinking about regulated as kind of being calm, being relaxed, feeling safe, feeling secure, feeling able to handle situations around you, being able to think ahead, being able to problem solve, being able to engage with other people, being able to make friends, being able to interact socially appropriately. In that state, we will seek rhythm to achieve that. That being said, I think most who have ever been around infants do this instinctively, and yet then we forget once children get a little older. So again, I'll take you to a place of imagination. Think about that infant that you've ever been around. And that infant all of a sudden wakes up and they have a dirty diaper and they're hungry or they're cold. And the only option that they have available to them to let us know that is to cry. They don't have a way to regulate themselves yet. They're very young. And so they cry. And like good caregivers, we go to them and we pick them up. And every time I ask this question of adults, they say things to me like, well, I pick them up and I sway with them, or I rock them, or I obviously change their diaper, I feed them, I rub their back, I kind of bounce them up and down, I pat them on their back, and all of the things that we instinctively seem to know to do with infants are rhythmic, and it calms and it soothes. And yet at some point, we kind of forget what the brain needs and what the body needs. And so by the time a child reaches, say, 6 or 7 and they're in school, we expect them to now be able to sit still and to pay attention and to raise a hand and all those things. And sometimes we forget that really what brings about that calmness is something rhythmic. And so what I really encourage is caregivers, whether that's in a child care setting, whether that's in your home, whether it's your own children, whether it's in a school, is to consider with young children bringing rhythm as often as you possibly can. That may look like we march through a transition, or we sing a song while we clean up the toys in the room, or we sit in a rocking chair and we rock together, or we dance to music together and have a really good time. We play with a yo-yo for a little older kids. We do some hip-hop dancing. We do jumping jacks. We run. We sway back and forth. All those things are great options to bring rhythm to a caregiving setting with a child. And that can be children of all ages. And I strongly encourage all of you who are on here, because I looked at where you came from, and not all of you are necessarily working with really young children. Some of you are working with teens, some of you have teens in your life, and some of you are supervisors, is to encourage rhythm even with adults. So if you see an adult who is particularly agitated, or is having difficulty focusing, or is stressed out, is looking kind of like they're having some difficulty staying calm, encourage a walk. Encourage a walk to go get a drink of water. Encourage a walk to the bathroom. Encourage them to close their eyes and deep breathe for a minute. Encourage them to rock in their office chair. And so, because I think it's also important for us to remember that adults have brains too, and that our brains respond. We have a few more coping skills than kids do, but that we have brains that react as well to stresses that are in the world. And so here in just a couple minutes, I will pause if people have some questions about any of the brain architecture stuff. And I'm just going to keep talking for just a couple minutes to give people time to raise hands, those kind of things, or type in any questions. So if you have those, let me know. As parents, one of the things that I want us to remember is that we're not just raising children to be the next year older. We really are raising children, hopefully, to be successful adults, and whether that means college or employment or families of their own or whatever that success looks like for them. I think it's important that we keep that perspective in mind. And teaching kids ways to calm down that are socially appropriate through all ages of their life are lifelong skills that they can use anywhere, that they can use on the job, that they can use when they become a parent. And so the more of those social skills, those emotional skills, those self-regulation skills that we can build in when they are young, they carry those through the rest of their life. They have a easier time making friends. They spend less time in the office at school. And as parents, then you spend less time in the office at school. And eventually that they turn into adults who raise their children doing the things that their parents did with them. And we begin to change trajectories for some of these kids. David, any questions have come across?
Actually, I've got a couple of people that are asking whether they can get a copy of your presentation of the PowerPoint.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to say no. These are pretty protected, so I can't send them electronically. I am willing to send them paper form, but I am not willing to send them electronically, and I apologize for that.
Okay, so what I'm writing down the couple people that I've got questions from that have asked about that. So if anybody else wants a paper form of them, if you just type in the question box, paper form, please, then I will jot that down, and we will make sure to get that to you. Let's see. Carol, do you have any thoughts, recommendations on therapeutic listening programs?
I don't. as far as what? Can you be a little bit more specific with that?
I'll give the questioner an opportunity to elaborate on that a little bit further. We also had another question about whether it's possible to alter the reaction of the brain stem to train the brain to react differently.
Yeah, great question. Therapeutic listening programs. I'm not familiar with that. So, Jill, if you can clarify that, that'd be great. Is it possible to train the brain to react differently? Yes, it is possible, depending on at what level the reaction is. If it's about a survival reaction, the brain is going to react. That's reality. If a bear walks in the room, your brain is going to react in a fight, flight, or freeze response. However, many times the threat that is perceived will be much more in a limbic system or any motor system. And so that perceived threat, absolutely. We can teach people to have skills in that moment. The brain will still react, but we can have skills in that moment to be able to calm so that we can make a better decision of reaction. So in that moment, recognizing the brain will still react, but can we teach ourselves how to cope with that and to do something different? Most definitely. And so I was kind of scrolling through these questions as well. Paper. Oh, yeah, now everybody's paper forming me, right? Yeah.
Let's see here.
Any other questions that aren't paper formed?
Yeah, what's the difference in effectiveness with an autistic child or any child with developmental delays?
Yeah. We get a lot of questions about autism. And I will say Dr. Perry has written a bit about autism in his book, Born for Love. So I certainly would encourage anybody who has that particular focus of interest to get the book and take a read. He's got a whole chapter in there, and the book itself is about building empathy in people, but he has one whole section of it that is about autism. My hesitation always in answering about autism is that I don't think that we know enough yet. But I think that what we do know is that regulating activities at the motor system of the brain, so rhythmic, repetitive kinds of behavior that are patterned and oftentimes body movement are going to be good for every brain. Okay, so they're going to regulate all of the neurotransmitters, all the messages that are firing in the brain, and get things a little more soothed in that area. So it's going to be good for a kid with autism. And if we think about oftentimes what we see with kids with autism is at those points when it's kind of seems overwhelming or too much is going in, there's some sensory kinds of reaction going on, is that we will see behaviors that truly tell us that they're dysregulated. So we'll see behaviors like the rocking, like some of the flapping, like some of the hopping, those kinds of things where we will actually see behaviors that kids are trying to regulate. And all too often, unfortunately, what we do on the outside is that we try to make that behavior stop. And at this point, even Dr. Perry will say, rather than trying to stop the behavior, can we embrace it, recognize it for what it is, and begin to find behaviors that are more socially appropriate for it, but recognizing it as a sign of dysregulation and helping the child learn how to regulate and how to manage some of those feelings that are going on. So I encourage you to read some more stuff about Dr. Perry's work with autism.
Are there resources for teaching teens the effects of music and visual media?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I'm sorry, I'm trying to read it as well. Teaching teens the effects of music and visual media. I'm sure that they are out there. They are not within this presentation and not anything even that our office has, but I certainly, there are effects. Music is a huge use for a rhythmic, repetitive kind of activity, and so can be used very effectively. And I think teaching kids what's happening to their brain when they're stressed out, those kinds of things can be incredibly effective. Because I think if people understand what's happening to their brain when they're feeling certain ways on the inside of the body, gives them power and control over how they respond. Rather than us feeling like we're just the victim of, well, I had a big feeling, so I punched a hole in the wall, understanding what's going on in your own brain, how to calm it, what works for you to calm it, is always powerful information. And so I really encourage people to share this information with kids and certainly with teens, and to recognize that music can be a really beneficial part of that, can be a way to self-regulate. It also can be that depending on the music that you choose, you may be putting some very negative messages in your head, and the body responds to those, and the brain responds to those. So thinking about, for kids oftentimes, though, it can be recognizing the rate of music that calms you. So is it that you're somebody who needs a really slow music, kind of that whole concept of classical music or meditation kinds of music in the background? Or are you somebody, when you get really amped up and stressed out, you need to listen to something that is at about 120 beats a minute and a great drum set roll? Do you need to hear some good old-fashioned drum beating rock and roll? Do you need to hear Indian, not what's the word I'm thinking of, djembe drums? Do you need to think about some Native American drumming kinds of music? So there can be absolutely regulating effects by listening to music. It's not something that I'm going to talk about or that you're going to find in the handout here.
Carol, I know that we need to keep going with the presentation, but could you a couple of real quick ones. On the slide, the DA, the NE, the SER that are blue circles, what do those stand for?
Yeah, great question. Those are neurotransmitters they're among hundreds of them in our brain, but they are three that mediate the most aspects of the highway system in the brain, and they're also the ones that people are the most familiar with. So I think you all can you see my cursor on the screen, or do I need to make a little red pen? I probably need a little red pen. So this one, no, stay right here. Pen, there we go. So this is the serotonergic or serotonin. This is the norepinephrine, and this is the dopaminergic or the dopamine. So those are the three that people are typically the most familiar with, and ones that will mediate the most aspects in the brain. So that's what those stand for.
And could you also real quick, what was the name of that book that you had mentioned before about developing empathy?
Yeah, it's called Born for Love.
Born for Love, okay. Mm-hmm. And again, everyone, I know we're getting a lot of questions, and again, they're all being archived, so if we're not able to get to them, you will get a response after in the next few days, in the next week, but we do have your questions noted. But I think we'll keep pushing on for now.
Keep moving on.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And for those of you who are book people and are interested, Born for Love is actually Dr. Perry's second book. His first book was called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. And if you are just finding out about Dr. Perry's work or are intrigued by anything of what I've shared with you today, I encourage you to read it as well. It's a fabulous read of his notes as a child psychiatrist and the ways that he used rhythm and repetition and relationship to really reach some really critically traumatized children to try and move them to a better place of functioning. So again, that was called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. This particular slide I've spent about 20 minutes on. Understand that we have a full 10-hour training that this gets about an hour and a half. So I've covered a very surface level of this slide with you. But I want to be sure and get to this slide and talk about the stress response system. So what you see on the screen right now is Dr. Perry's heuristic explanation of the stress response system. And so what you are looking at here is the dotted lines represent the brain picture that I just had up, that inverted triangle, turned on its side. And so if you look at the second row down, you will see the levels of the brain that I was just talking about. So you see the brainstem, you see the midbrain, you see the limbic system, and the cortex. And then he, in this picture, is talking about the sense of time, the types of cognition, and the mental state of arousal that a person is in that part of their brain. So taking a look at this particular slide, I want to particularly draw your attention to the states at the bottom. And I want to talk about those for a little bit. The state of calm is really a state that is limited to time when you are in solitude. You're in a time of reflection. It is the time that you're the most creative. It's the time when you can think the farthest ahead, and that you are able to really solve things creatively. You're able to think very far into the future and very abstract. So this might be that moment right before you fall to sleep at night, and all of a sudden you have all of the things that you forgot to do all day hit your brain. That's because you finally got calm enough for that to happen. I encourage you to leave a piece of paper beside your bed for when that happens. For me, it happens in the shower because it's quiet and it's rhythmic and there's water. And so I'll have lots of great ideas about things that we could do at work. Maybe for you it's time, if you are someone who meditates, or if you're someone who does yoga alone, or you run alone, you walk alone, you may have a lot of great thoughts there. Again, a time when you're using rhythm, you're using repetition, and you're by yourself. So your brain has the ability to kind of go to a reflective place. As we enter the world from being alone and another person enters our sphere, we enter the state of alert. We can't be in calm if we're with other people, unfortunately, and that's okay. We're still in our cortex. It just means we can't think quite as far ahead. We are not quite as creative because we now have to spend some of that brain energy dealing with the world. We have to think about social cues, and we have to listen for voice tone, and we have to think about other people, and we have to think about where our body is in space to other people. So it just takes a little more energy from our brain to do those kinds of functions, so we don't have as much to be creative with. A little more concrete in our thinking, and this is where we really want people to be when they're at work or when they're at school, when they're in our child care setting, when we're trying to interact with them and teach them a new skill. This is really where we want people to be. However, not everybody is there. That's the unfortunate reality of our world for some of our kids who have experienced types of trauma, kids who have grown up in toxic stress. I'm going to talk about that just a little bit more here in a second. When we have had something happen in the day, we get too stressed out. When we have had some trauma, when we've had some toxic stress kinds of issues, we may be in a state of alarm. And now a perfectly normally functioning person can reach the state of alarm at some point in a day and then bounce back to alert. So if you find yourself in this state, it's not that you need therapy and you're all traumatized. It just means you maybe got a little stressed out. So this is that moment when all of a sudden you realize you've just missed a deadline, or the deadline is coming really quickly, or someone has walked in that is unfamiliar to you. There's a loud noise, some of those kinds of things, as well as a response to a threat in the environment. It's a state that's a little more emotional because it's hit our limbic system. And at this point, what's important to realize is that for the most part, our cortex has kind of checked offline. We're really reacting to the situation through our limbic system. And remember, that's where our emotions are held. So it may be a situation where normally, if you were a little calmer, you would handle it very calmly, but because you're not in that state, you snip at somebody, or you yell at somebody, or you get frustrated and you slam a phone down. Those kinds of responses. I also want to, in that particular state, draw your attention to the sense of time. Because at that point, your best hope is to think about minutes, maybe hours ahead. I share this with you because about 80% of our kids who have experienced trauma or toxic stress spend about 80% of their day in a state of alarm. That's in direct contrast to a fairly normally functioning person spends about 80% of their day in a state of alert. So kids, people who have experienced lots of toxic stress and trauma are going to have a really hard time thinking ahead, being creative, engaging with other people. There's going to be a lot of challenge to that because they are making decisions and responding to the world in the moment, in the minute, in the hour that's immediately ahead, and in an emotional state. So when we think about that in terms of kids, part of it can be that their brain isn't as fully developed in the cortex, so they don't have as much of that cortex to use. So they hit that emotional state a little quicker than hopefully most of us adults do. The other part of that, though, is that if they are perceiving a threat in the world, if they have some trauma in their background, if they have some toxic stress kinds of issues going on, they may be pretty reactive to the world. So they get easily frustrated and slam down a pencil. They get easily frustrated and they throw a toy at their brother. They get very easily, they may cry very easily. Their emotions are right there kind of on that surface. Because kids don't have as much of a functioning cortex, they also have a harder time thinking ahead and making decisions and thinking about the future consequences of that. I think as adults who are in childcare settings, as teachers, as coaches, as parents, we really need to stop sometimes and think about, as a child is reacting to us and is behaving in a way that we are finding challenging or we are finding irritating, annoying, that child may not have a different behavior to choose based on where they are in their mental state. So a little sensitivity to that moment. Now, throughout that whole piece of that, I just used that word toxic stress at least 30 times. So let me talk a little bit about what I mean by that. I talked early on in the webinar about trauma and event-based trauma. We also now know, based on the research of Dr. Perry and many others, that there is a whole other piece to brain development being affected by what some call toxic stress, some call complex developmental trauma. We call it lots of different things, but really what we're talking about is growing up, kids growing up in an environment that is chaotic, that may be unsafe, where they are unsure, where they are food insecure, where they are financially insecure, they may be housing insecure, they are living with someone with a severe mental illness, they are living with someone with an addiction, they are witnessing domestic violence, they are being the victim of domestic violence, they are witnessing or being the victim of sexual abuse or physical abuse, they are very transient, and so there's not a lot of stability in the home. And I say all of that to be toxic stress because it's not a one-time event. It is happening over and over and over and over again. And what it is doing in brain development is laying a template that says the world may not be safe. And I need to react as such. And what happens is that kids begin to live more in that lower part of their brain and react to any perceived threat. And oftentimes it will be a misperception of threat that they react to, and they will react in a very emotional or potentially physical way, depending on what part of their brain is really being activated by that. So it may be if the motor region is really being activated by that, it could be that they are acting out in terms of running, or they are aggressive, or they are hiding, they are kicking and biting and those kinds of things. Or it could be that they have learned to just stop behaving and they literally are just shutting down. And so we watch for kind of that maladaptive survival response that can happen as a result of kind of living in that toxic stress environment. There is an enormous amount of research out there about toxic stress. So if you want to know more about that, if you're intrigued by any of those things that I just said, I really encourage you to take a look out there. You Google toxic stress, you'll be busy for days, and there's lots and lots and lots of good information out there. The piece of that I really challenge parents and teachers and coaches and mentors to think about is that if a child has grown up and their brain is developing in an environment of toxic stress and complex developmental trauma, what we see as a result is literally less gray matter space in their brain. We see delays in the development of neural connections. We may see varying delays of speech and motor movement and those kind of things, but we certainly see an enormous response in their social emotional skills. And so we may see a child who just socially and emotionally has a very difficult time functioning in the world in a way that is socially appropriate. The best news of our day is that those can be taught and that can be remediated. And really the call to action is that it has to be remediated, is that we as adults, the best thing that we can do is begin to step up to that and fall in love with these kids and really begin to mentor them and support their growth and development and teach those social skills. The number one way to build that resiliency and social skill in kids is a caring, loving, predictable, nurturing, safe adult. And that doesn't have to be a parent. That can be the Sunday school teacher, it can be the babysitter, it can be the child care worker, it can be the teacher, it can be the coach, it can be the mentor, it can be the neighbor, it can be grandma or grandpa. it can be aunt or uncle. What's important is that someone is creating a loving, nurturing, predictable, secure, safe relationship with that child. We will see outcomes that are absolutely devastating when a child doesn't have that relationship and that security. We will see outcomes that are absolutely amazing when they get it. And so really, I love the title of Dr. Perry's second book, Born for Love, because that's really what it boils down to, is to create relationship, bond, and fall in love with kids and create those safe relationships with them. I want to, in just a couple minutes, give you an opportunity to ask some more questions. In the meantime, I will leave you to think about the slide that is up, is the kids who need the most love will ask for it in the most unloving of ways. And so when we begin to see those behaviors from children, recognizing them as maladaptive, survival, and dysregulation, rather than an intentional annoyance or an intentional need to manipulate a situation, is that really oftentimes behaviors are going to be the result of maladaptive behaviors that have worked and survival, and they are going to be a scream for help me regulate. They're a sign of dysregulation that says, please, somebody help me regulate, let me move, let me do something rhythmic, let me take a walk, run up and down some stairs, rock in a rocking chair, chew some gum, whatever that is, but give me something that is repetitive, is rhythmic, and relational to do. So I'm guessing, David, you have some more questions for me.
Definitely. Let's see. How does anxiety and or depression fit into the continuum you were discussing?
Yeah, a lot of that is believed at this point to be related to those neurotransmitters, and so oftentimes when we talk about medications for those issues, we are talking about things that are impacting the neurotransmitters. And so are those neurotransmitters functioning as they need to, as well as do we have that bottom part of the brain regulated enough that the rest of the brain can take over into things like calming emotions and thinking and using coping skills. I think, and even people who have heard Dr. Perry early on here in Franklin County know sometimes he gets a little intense about cognitive behavioral therapy. And cognitive behavioral therapy, very widely used. He doesn't take a stance on whether it's good or bad. What he will say is that it needs to be well timed. So if we have somebody who is incredibly depressed, incredibly anxious, and is incredibly dysregulated, all the cognitive behavioral therapy in the world, it can't be effective right then. So we'll do some of that regulation first, and then create some relationship, and then we can begin to use the reasoning part of the brain. So what you see up on the screen now is in somewhat response to that. So whenever we're having a sequence of engagement or an interaction, a sequence of intervention at some level, recognizing what we need to do that's developmentally respectful. So we need to regulate someone first, create relationship, and then we can begin to reason with them. So for kids who have experienced incredible trauma or toxic stress, we may begin to see a lot of those signs of anxiety or depression. So let's go back and do what we know is developmentally respectful in the brain. Have we taken the time to help that person regulate their body, which will regulate what's going on in the brain, which will help regulate some of those neurotransmitters? Have we created that safe, nurturing, predictable, loving relationship? And then at that point, we can, and at some point should, teach those coping skills that take the cortex to be able to do. What all too often, unfortunately, we do as adults is that we just reason with kids, or we reason with someone who is dysregulated. So we'll say, well, just calm down. It's okay. It's going to be fine. Or, well, you don't want to do that. You'll just hurt yourself. That's just, your parents would be really upset. And we can talk all day long and we will sound like Charlie Brown's teacher. Because at the point that someone is feeling that way, at the point that someone is acting in ways that are showing us that they're dysregulated, when we reason with them, we're expecting them to be able to use their cortex, and they can't. And so let's go backward, be as respectful as we were to that infant when we rocked them, and let's do some of those regulating things, and we'll work our way up to the reasoning.
Understanding that it's obviously different with every child, is there a somewhat approximate time when a child shows improvement from toxic stress when they're in a loving and nurturing environment?
There is not. That is incredibly individual. It's incredibly individual as to when did those events occur, for how long. In fact, one of the things that we know is that if a child has experienced toxic stress or trauma in the womb or in the first year of life, that the impact on the brain and its development is far more profound than at any other time in life. And so, did an event happen, or were you suddenly involved, like all of a sudden your mom got involved with someone who, and when you were age 12, who was a domestic violence offender, but up until that point everything had been good. So, did that happen at 12, or did that happen when you were 6 months? Will have profound different impact on the brain. The later it happens, the better, obviously, because more of the brain is developed, and we've had more time to build in resiliency. So how long it takes is as individual as what was the age, what happened, what was the response, what was the support network like, all of those kind of things, and really we have no way to say, well, in 6 months you should be done. There's just not, unfortunately.
I see we have about 8 minutes left, and I want to make sure you get through everything you were going to go through.
Sure.
So
I see here that somebody asked about the Brain Balance Program. I do not have any information on it, nor am I going to share any. I have heard of it and have done a little bit of research into it. Dr. Perry doesn't take a stance on it one way or the other, so I apologize, I can't speak to that directly. Thinking about what we've shared today as far as the brain, if that's really something that somebody's interested in, I would encourage you to dig a little deeper into Dr. Perry's work. Rub it up against what you're hearing in the Brain Balance Program. Does it seem to make sense? Does it seem to be developmentally respectful and trauma-informed, and go from there. But not a program that I can take a stance on one way or the other. Great question here. Is it important for a child that went through a traumatic event to have a routine schedule? Absolutely. First of all, let me say I think it's important for all kids to have a schedule. I think it's important for all of us, because one of the things that can be incredibly regulating for all of us is predictability. One of the things that will activate that stress response that I showed with the dotted lines on it, one of the things that activates the stress response immediately for everybody is novelty, or things that are unexpected. So when we encounter something new, our brain has to kind of go through that whole period of, this isn't familiar to me, so what do I know about this, and how can I learn about it? So if it's a routine, and suddenly I've changed the routine, or I'm going somewhere different, or any of those kinds of things, it's going to activate the stress response. I know, if I have the best laid plan on a Saturday and I get up and I have a flat tire, my stress response goes up. And that has nothing to do with trauma or lack of trauma in my life. That's about it wasn't predictable, and your brain reacts to that. So schedules are absolutely good for all of us. They're really good for kids, period, and they're certainly good for kids who have experienced some trauma. What is the prenatal impact of physical neglect, not enough food for mom, on the rhythm piece? Yeah, great question. I did not get to talk a lot about, so I will briefly talk about the impact of intrauterine insult, which can also be one of the things that gets lumped in and labeled with toxic stress and complex developmental trauma. In utero, when I talked about those trillion neural connections being made, I was really talking about a pretty healthy womb. And we know that they're not always. And so if while pregnant, mom was using drugs or alcohol, mom was in a domestic violence relationship, mom was homeless, mom was living in a pretty chaotic environment, mom had a big car crash, fell down steps, those kind of things, all of those things could, not necessarily every kid, but could have some pretty profound impact on brain development. And so the impact, if mom is hungry or homeless or food insecure, is financially insecure, those kind of things, what's happening in mom's body is that her stress response is being activated, which raises her heart rate, which then impacts the kid's rhythm that the kid finds soothing. So what we end up with is everybody's rhythm is a little bit different. We may have people whose rhythm is very slow. We may have people whose rhythm is very fast. So much like I was talking about what kind of music you like to listen to, it can be an indicator of your rhythm. If we need to soothe that infant, typically mom kind of knows that rhythm best because it was her heart rate. And so, do you have that kid that you sway nice and slow and gentle with, or do you have the kid that you swing as hard as you can in the car seat and hope they don't fall out? And so we have to think about that. For teachers and child care providers, that can become particularly profound in that you now have anywhere from 12 to 30 kids sitting in front of you, each who has a little bit different rhythm. And so one of the things that I really encourage in group settings like that is recognize that there are going to be kids in your room who have a very high rhythm, who had that mom who herself had a high heart rate or who was stressed out or any of those kind of things. And you need to regulate them too. So do something that's a very fast pace. Do something that's jumping jacks or push-ups or Zumba dancing or those kinds of things. And then follow it with a slower activity. So bring that down with some stretching, some deep breathing, some rocking, some imagination kinds of things. Because what will happen is the kids who needed it really fast got regulated, and they will hold on to that for 20 to 30 minutes. And then the kid who needs to slow down a little bit, you've regulated them with some deep breathing and stretching, and they will hold on to that for 20 or 30 minutes. And then you've got a group that's a little more regulated and ready to learn, ready to be friendly with each other, ready to share, ready to do all the things that they need to do. So, mom, that intrauterine environment can become very, very critical to that rhythm piece. Are you going to provide examples of strategies you mentioned on calming and coping for stress? Yes. In fact, I hope that you've picked up on all of the ones that I've talked about. We were talking lots about dance and rocking and walking and drinking water and exercise. Understand that for teens, a lot of times what's really where they are in brain development is that their limbic system is the most developed, and we're kind of waiting on that cortex to catch up at that point. And so what they find incredibly rewarding at that stage of development is their peers. And so, can you give them paired up time? Can you give them small group time? Can you give them some time with their friends and then ask them to do what you need them to do? So friendships is another way to have things very rewarding. Okay, I'm scrolling through questions. Unfortunately, I can only see them one line at a time. So looks like I've gotten most of these. Is it possible that toxic stress is experienced differently by different children and teens? Absolutely. Again, it's about what kinds of resiliency factors do they already have in place, what kinds of supports, what age are they, how developed is the brain, those kinds of things. Any other ones that you really want me to grab, David, as I'm scrolling through here?
We had a couple folks that just asked, given that questions will be recorded and archived and responded to, yeah. They just want to, if you have additional slides or topics, just to do a quick run through of those.
Sure. Can these be taught to adults who have been exposed to these environments? Absolutely. Please send the link. Sure. Yeah. One of the things that I'm seeing a lot of you really enjoy some of this information, want to share it. I encourage you to keep your eye out. Dr. Perry's in Ohio frequently. He's in neighboring states periodically, those kind of things. You certainly can bring him to your area, but keep an eye out on that. Is well worth the trip to go see him and see what he has to say, because he's going to do a far better job than I did and go a lot deeper. First of all, he'll have longer than an hour, but he can give you a whole lot more information. In the meantime, if you can't see him, he has some great stuff online. He has some YouTube videos out. that are wonderful. He has lots of articles. He has published a lot of articles, and they are out there on the web. So take a look at those as well. So you can dig in and get to know as much as you want. Your son tells you you sound like Charlie Brown's teacher, then stop talking. Absolutely. I love it. You just have to make sure that he's ready before you start doing that. So good. I'll do at least a quick run through of the remaining topics and slides. Can I do a quick run through? I cannot because I'm out of time. So I encourage you to keep an eye out for a seminar with Dr. Perry, read some articles, and take a look at the web. I will be glad to field email questions, those kinds of things from folks. But there is a lot of information out there on the web, and so take a look. And I really appreciate everybody spending some time with us today. I hope that you found it beneficial and informational. I know it is incredibly exciting for me every time that I talk about this information. The hardest thing I do is put it in a short amount of time. And so I hope that I got to some of the questions that you wanted answered. David, I really appreciate all of your help making this happen. Certainly a thank you to the Ohio Children's Trust Fund, Red Tree House, the Ohio Family and Children First Council, and the Ronald McDonald House. So thank you all for your time. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
And thank you, Carol, for the presentation and for taking time. And again, everyone, you'll be probably in the next day or so getting an email, follow-up email from the webinar that'll have a brief survey. We'd appreciate it if you'd fill that out and complete the survey. And also it'll have contact information if you have additional questions. Again, if we had questions that you typed in that we did not get to, we will get to those and get a response to you. And hoping in the next several days to have the presentation on Red Tree House's website. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.